67 BC, and the results of what happened are celebrated. After 3 years, it led to a revolt, and after 3 years, they rededicated the temple from that outrage, and they celebrate that to this day in Hanukkah. And we'll talk more about that when we get there. But while I'm here, I didn't want to miss the point. Do you notice what Jesus says? When ye therefore shall what? See. See, the abomination of desolation occurs in the Holy of Holies. Who gets to go in the Holy of Holies? Anyone here been in one? Only under normal way, only the high priest, only once a year, and after great ceremonial preparation at Yom Kippur. So the Holy of Holies is inside the holy place, which is inside the temple. How can you, assuming you're somebody in Judea, see this going on? How do you see that? On CNN. And I'm not being facetious. In other words, this is a major political event that happens inside, in the Holy of Holies, inside the holy place, inside the temple. That's how we know there'll be a temple standing for this to happen. And how will you, if you're in Judea, when you shall see this, then let them which be in Judea. It doesn't limit the people seeing it. It could be around the world. But when this happens, then let them which be in Judea flee into the mountains. Not New York or LA or wherever. Those who are in Judea. Why? You need to understand what's going on here. But this is a major trigger point. It's a prophecy. It will mean nothing to you until you go to that passage that Jesus is pointing them to in Daniel and understand the context of all of this, which is what we're about. But when that happens, Jesus says, let them which be in Judea flee the mountains. And then he says, let him which is on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. If you've been in Israel, you know the houses that are on hillsides, they typically are, it's very hilly. It's the roof that is sort of the patio. It's the place they spend the cool of the evening on. Not the backyard, they're not that large, but it's on the roof. The roof is sort of like a fellowship place. You go downstairs to get to the bedrooms and all the rest of it, see? Let him that is on the housetop, typical social place, not come down to take anything out of his house. In other words, he's saying, you split, and you split now. Neither let him which is in the field return back to take his clothes. And woe unto them that are with child, and to them that give suck in those days, because they're going to have a logistics problem, because they've got to flee with that burden, that handicap. Get this last phrase. Pray that your flight be not in winter, neither on the Sabbath day. Is he talking to Gentiles here? Keep that in mind, because the whole study tonight is going to focus on Israel and Jews, not Gentiles. And you'll see why. It's very important to understand. He is directing this to his disciples, which are Jewish, but it's obviously yet future, and yet his focus here is, most people don't fully recognize the Jewishness of Matthew 24. Because he goes on to say later, he says, for then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. He is quoting from Daniel 12. We'll look at that shortly. But Jesus himself labels not 7 years, the last half of that 7-year period, as the Great Tribulation. He labels it right here, drawing from Daniel 12. And we'll get into that shortly. But then he makes another statement. He says, and except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. That's a technology statement again. We've already had an allusion here to worldwide television. We also have here an allusion to advanced weapons. If you read verse 22 during the Civil War, it wouldn't mean much to you. You can't imagine the world wiping itself out with muskets and bayonets. But today, the nuclear cloud hangs over every geopolitical decision on the planet Earth. Except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. That's a technology statement, history and left. Well, that's the context. I want to start in the New Testament, springboard from there, because we're going to follow his advice here and go into Daniel chapter 9, which is the allusion that he was making. And now a couple of things, another fact that most of you are familiar with, but I want to emphasize it because it's going to be of profound significance to you when you get to verse 25 of Daniel 9. The original Hebrew text is typically called the Vorlage. It was the Old Testament. We're talking about Old Testament here. The Tanakh, as the Jews would call it. That was really assembled, we understand, in the days of Ezra and Nehemiah. 4 or 5 centuries, several centuries before the Gospel period. When you get to the 3rd century before Christ, if you were a Jew, you probably did not know much Hebrew. You spoke Greek. Greek was the enforced language under Alexander the Great and following. Latin became the official language of the Roman Empire, but even in the Roman Empire, it took a while to, it was the official language. Everybody spoke Greek. Greek was the language. If you were Jewish, that was frustrating. You used Hebrew the way a Catholic uses Latin. You might know some Hebrew for ceremonial reasons, certain prayers and things, but it wasn't necessarily a comfortable language to you. And for that reason, the Jewish community aspired to having their scriptures translated into Greek, the common and very precise language of the day. So under Ptolemy Philadelphus II, starting about 285 BC and finishing at 270 BC, he commissioned 70 top scholars. Some say 72. Some say there were 6 from each of the 12 tribes. There's all kinds of legends about this, but the word 70, the word Septuagint, is just a fancy word for 70. Their work product, that 15-year work product, is known as the Septuagint translation. The point I want you to keep in mind is that was in black and white 3 centuries before Christ's ministry. The Greek version, the Septuagint version of the Old Testament, was the Christian's Bible during the New Testament period. Most of your New Testament quotes from the Old are from the Septuagint, the Greek, not the Hebrew. So I just want to, the reason I want to emphasize this, setting aside who wrote Daniel and under what circumstances, for our purposes tonight, it doesn't matter. It was in black and white 300 years before Christ makes references here. You need to understand that before some surprising discoveries here. And understand the Septuagint. You need to understand the importance of the Septuagint translation. The Masoretic text, the Hebrew text that we have of the Old Testament, was actually derived from the Council of Yamnia in 90 AD, but most of it, as we have it today, is really about 9th century. So it came much later than the Septuagint, and that's when you have a Hebrew quote of the Old Testament, it's usually from the Masoretic text. But the Septuagint is the most useful for our purposes because it predates the New Testament period by 3 centuries. Now in Daniel 9, it's also known as the interrupted prayer. There are 3 important primary prayers in the historical books of the Old Testament. Ezra 9, Nehemiah 9, and Daniel 9. It happens to be 9 in all 3, which is not any significance, I think. It just will help remember it. But we're going to look at the first 19 verses of this chapter are Daniel's prayer. And then Gabriel interrupts his prayer. And he gives Daniel the most astonishing 4 verses in the entire Bible. That's why we're here. The so-called 70-week prophecy, verses 24 to the end. 24, 25, 26, 27. But let's start with a prayer. Most people jump right into the 4 verses. This is too important to be cut corners. Let's jump in and get the context here. Daniel chapter 9, verse 1. In the 1st year of Darius, the son of Ahasuerus, the seed of the Medes, which was made king over the realm of the Chaldeans, and he goes on. Now these are titles. Some people believe that Darius was the uncle of Cyrus, but that's conjecture by some of the scholars. He was made, it says, he was made king, implies a passive recipient in some kind, so that leads to other scholastic speculations. But the important part of this is, setting aside the successions in the Persian Empire, is verse 2. In the 1st year of his reign, I, Daniel, understood by books the number of the years whereof the word of the Lord came to Jeremiah the prophet, that he would accomplish 70 years in the desolations of Jerusalem. So Daniel, this whole thing starts because Daniel was reading his Bible. And he was reading specifically in the book of Jeremiah. Now the first thing that will leap out at you if you're a student of the Bible is that Daniel took Jeremiah literally. When Jeremiah talks about 70 years captivity, it wasn't allegorical. It wasn't approximate. Daniel assumes it's precise. In fact, he knows it's about over. And he does something